Welcome to the Right News Network.
Welcome to your World News Update. I'm Emma Hurt, bringing you today's top stories from around the globe. The Supreme Court is considering whether hundreds of thousands of Haitian and Syrian immigrants could lose their legal protection to live and work in America. Our Middle East correspondent Layla Nazari has more on what this case means for families caught in the middle. Layla?
Well, Emma, the Supreme Court heard arguments Wednesday on whether the Trump administration can strip temporary protected status from about 600,000 people. That's Syrians, Haitians, and others who've been living and working legally here because their home countries are too dangerous to return to. Right now, these folks have work permits, they pay taxes, they're integrated into communities across the country. But the administration argues it has the power to end that protection whenever it wants.
What's the core legal question the justices are wrestling with?
Look, it comes down to who gets to decide, the president or Congress. The Trump administration says the law gives them authority to terminate TPS whenever they feel conditions have improved. But immigrant advocates are arguing the statute actually requires the administration to prove conditions really have gotten better in Haiti and Syria, which, honestly, that's a pretty hard case to make right now. The conservative majority on the court seems sympathetic to the administration's position.
Layla Nazari, thank you for that reporting. Remaining with world affairs, the standoff between the Trump administration and Iran is now directly impacting energy prices globally and creating real hardship for Europeans. Layla, you are still here. What's the latest on the diplomatic front?
Well, Emma, right now we're seeing Trump essentially abandon the nice guy approach. He's posted these AI images threatening Iran, saying they need to get smart and make a deal. But Tehran isn't backing down. In fact, Iranian lawmakers are doubling down, saying they'll never give up control of the Strait of Hormuz. So we're at this really tense standoff where neither side seems willing to budge.
And what does that mean for the rest of the world watching this play out?
Look, the economic impact is immediate. Oil's already hit $114 a barrel, and the U.S. is threatening to expand its port blockade even more. The EU is seriously worried. They're saying this energy crisis could last years and really hurt European households and businesses. On top of that, there's this human rights dimension nobody's really talking about. The UN just documented that Iran's executed 21 people and detained thousands since the war started. So you've got economic pain, geopolitical brinkmanship, and serious humanitarian concerns all colliding at once.
Layla, appreciate the reporting. Remaining with that energy crisis, the U.S. is now paying $4.23 per gallon of gas, the highest price in 4 years, as negotiations with Iran remain completely stalled. The timing couldn't be worse, with summer travel season just weeks away. We'll continue monitoring whether diplomacy can break through before prices climb even higher. Also on the world front, Russian forces are raining down hundreds of attacks on eastern Ukraine, with at least 19 strikes on Donetsk and 833 across Zaporizhia in a single day. The barrage has killed at least 3 people and wounded more than 10 others as Moscow intensifies its push to break Ukrainian defenses. Expect continued Russian pressure in the coming weeks as winter approaches. Moving to business now, Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong has secured a significant commitment from Beijing on jet fuel supplies, a critical resource for Australia's economy and aviation sector. Our finance editor, Sophia Reeves, has this. Sophia?
Well, Emma, thanks. So Wong confirmed after meetings in Beijing that China is actually engaging directly with Australian businesses on jet fuel supplies. Here's the thing. China controls the export volumes, and they'd actually suspended all fuel exports back in March. Now they're approving 500,000 metric tons for May, which is up from 300,000 tons in April. but that's still way below the 1.6 million ton average from last year.
So, what's the real leverage here? Who's got the upper hand?
Look, I think it's genuinely mutual. China needs Australia's commodities and food imports to keep its economy stable, right? And Australia can't function without jet fuel and fertilizer from China. Wang basically made that public, saying if Beijing wants steady shipments from Australian businesses, they've got to keep the fuel coming. What's interesting is the volumes are still tight, so Beijing's clearly using this as a negotiating tool while they work things out.
Sophia, appreciate it. Turning to the Middle East, Israeli military operations in Lebanon are claiming more civilian lives, including emergency responders. 3 rescue workers and 5 family members were killed in successive airstrikes on Tuesday, attacks that raise new questions about targeting practices. International scrutiny is intensifying as Israeli officials defend their bombing campaign, while humanitarian organizations warn of mounting civilian casualties. Remaining with world affairs, France is now evacuating its citizens from Mali after weekend attacks that have shaken the country's military government. Our defense correspondent Marcus Webb is following developments. Marcus, what's the latest from the ground?
Well, Emma, over the weekend, jihadist and Tuareg separatist forces launched coordinated attacks across Mali that really caught the junta off guard. France and the UK have both told their citizens it's time to get out. What's interesting is this is the first major test of Mali's military government since they took power, and they're struggling to contain it.
How significant is this moment for France's broader strategy in West Africa?
Look, this is huge for Paris. They spent over a decade fighting militants in Mali, pulled their troops out just last year, thinking local forces could handle it. Now Russia's moved in as the key ally to the junta, and frankly, France is watching from the sidelines. This either gets contained quickly, or we're looking at real destabilization across the entire Sahel region.
Marcus Webb, thank you. On the energy front, the Trump administration is doubling down on a naval blockade at one of the world's most critical choke points, and the move could reshape global oil markets. Still with us is energy correspondent Marcus Webb. Marcus, what's the latest on this blockade?
Well, Emma, the Trump administration just told its aides to prepare for what could be a really extended blockade at the Strait of Hormuz. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent put out this statement on Tuesday saying Iran's oil industry is already starting to shut down production because of it. We're talking about the strait that handles roughly 1/3 of all global seaborne oil trade. So this is a massive deal for energy markets worldwide.
So how long are we talking about here?
Look, there's no timeline being given, but the language from the administration suggests this isn't a short-term thing. They're framing it as yielding results, and they're not backing down. What's interesting is that historically, every time you see sustained disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz, you get real ripple effects on global oil prices. We could be looking at tighter supplies, higher costs at the pump, and genuine pressure on energy-dependent economies.
Marcus, appreciate the reporting on this developing situation. Moving to the markets now, where 2 of the world's biggest industries are hitting a wall at the same time. Airlines are bidding wars for fuel they can't find, while trillions in power plant projects sit stuck on paper. Sophia is back with us. Sophia, what's the latest?
Well, Emma, here's the thing. It's not that money's the problem anymore. We're looking at an $8 trillion pipeline for new power generation globally, but almost none of it's actually getting built. And at the same time, airlines are literally fighting each other for jet fuel because there's just not enough supply. So you've got 2 massive sectors squeezed at once.
Why can't these projects just get built if the capital's there?
Look, converting a plan into an actual power plant takes permitting, supply chains that are still broken, skilled workers, all the execution stuff that no one planned for. It's not a spending problem, it's a doing problem. And with airlines cannibalizing fuel shipments from each other, We're seeing the stress test hit in real time.
Sophia, thank you. Now we turn to our in-depth segment. One story, every angle, the full picture. The Supreme Court is having what can only be described as a consequential week, hearing arguments on whether hundreds of thousands of Haitian and Syrian immigrants can lose their protected status, handing down a landmark ruling on the Voting Rights Act that critics say guts a civil rights cornerstone. And all of this landing the same week, a grand jury indicts former FBI Director James Comey for the second time over an Instagram post many interpreted as a threat against President Trump. These are not routine legal developments. This is the constitutional architecture of the United States being actively rebuilt in real time. Joining me now are Marcus Webb, our defense and security analyst, and Sophia Reeves, our economics and markets editor. Marcus, let me start with you. Is the Supreme Court doing the country a service this week, or is it dismantling protections that millions of people genuinely depend on?
Thanks, Emma. Look, what the Supreme Court is doing this week is what courts are supposed to do: interpret the law as written, not as activists wish it had been written. Let's start with TPS. The clue is in the name. Temporary Protected Status. The program was created in 1990. Some of these families have been in temporary status for over 30 years. That is not a humanitarian program anymore. That is an unlegislated amnesty scheme operating by bureaucratic inertia. The Trump administration isn't breaking the law by trying to terminate it. It is enforcing the law that Congress passed. Douglas Murray has made this point brilliantly. Western nations have been systematically misled about the permanence of these so-called emergency measures, and anyone who dares to enforce the original terms gets branded a monster. And on the Voting Rights Act ruling, drawing congressional districts by racial composition isn't protecting democracy. It's institutionalizing racial classification. Chief Justice Roberts said years ago that the way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. He was right then, and the court is right now. The uncomfortable truth the left won't say out loud is that these programs have been stretched so far beyond their original intent that they bear almost no resemblance to what Congress authorized.
But, Marcus, isn't there a real human cost here? We're talking about people who have built lives, raised American-born children, run businesses, some for literally decades. Doesn't the rule of law have to grapple with that reality? And Sophia, what's your take on this?
Well, look, I'm not going to dismiss the human element, but here's what I think Marcus is missing in his framing. The economic argument for cleaning up the TPS mess is actually more compelling than the purely legal one, and it's the one the administration keeps failing to make. Ken Cuccinelli said it himself on News Nation this week. We don't have systems in place to catch fraud before the fact, at all levels of government. That's not a rounding error. That's a systemic failure that costs taxpayers billions. But here's my frustration with how the Trump administration is handling this. You can't just yank status from 700,000 people without the enforcement infrastructure to manage what comes next. The deportation apparatus doesn't exist at that scale. The immigration courts are already backlogged by years. So the legal victory, and it may well be a legal victory, could produce administrative chaos that actually undermines the broader case for strong immigration enforcement. You win in court, and then you drown in implementation.
I hear what Sophia is saying, but with respect, that misses the point entirely. The fact that we lack the infrastructure to enforce the law is not an argument for not enforcing the law. It's an argument for building the infrastructure. Fast. You don't leave a border open because closing it is logistically complicated. You close it and you figure out the logistics. That's what governing actually requires. And frankly, the Comey indictment this week tells you everything you need to know about why this matters so urgently. The former director of the FBI posted imagery depicting 8647, widely understood as a call to eliminate the 47th president, and he wants us to believe he found it by accident on a beach. Come on. The same institutional class that spent years weaponizing federal law enforcement against conservatives is now shocked that accountability might arrive at their door. Ben Shapiro is absolutely right. There is a two-tiered justice system in this country, and dismantling it requires exactly this kind of aggressive prosecution.
Here's what I want to know, because this isn't just about today's rulings. If the court rules for the Trump administration on TPS and the Comey prosecution moves forward simultaneously, are we heading toward genuine institutional reform, or are we heading toward a constitutional crisis that tears the country apart? Sophia, where do you see this playing out?
The way I see this playing out, and this is the scenario that keeps me up at night from an economic and institutional stability standpoint, is a situation where the administration wins every legal battle and still loses the war. If current trends continue, you get TPS terminated by court order, you get mass deportation proceedings initiated, and then you get an immigration court system that simply cannot process the caseload. The backlog explodes. Cases drag on for years. The political cost mounts, and the narrative shifts from the rule of law prevails to chaos and cruelty. That's not a hypothetical. That's the trajectory based on what Cuccinelli and others are telling us about system readiness. The real risk here is that a legitimate legal and policy victory gets squandered by implementation failure, and the left uses that failure as a weapon in 2026.
Here's what concerns me most, and it goes beyond the TPS case. The Comey indictment is a historic moment, and almost nobody in the mainstream media is treating it that way. A man who ran the FBI, who oversaw politically motivated investigations, who has never been held to account for any of it, is now facing his second federal indictment. If this prosecution succeeds, it sends a message to the entire permanent bureaucratic class that is genuinely unprecedented. But if it fails, if the DOJ overreaches, if the case collapses, if a sympathetic jury in the wrong jurisdiction acquits, then the entire project of institutional accountability gets poisoned. The deep state gets to say, see, it was political all along. That's the scenario that history warns us about. Accountability movements that stumble give their targets exactly the ammunition they need to survive.
Marcus Webb, Sophia Reeves, a genuinely extraordinary week at the Supreme Court, a second Comey indictment, and a constitutional reckoning that is only just beginning. One thing is absolutely certain. James Comey's lawyer isn't sleeping well tonight, and neither, frankly, should the institutions that spent years thinking the rules didn't apply to them. Russia has launched 833 attacks on the Zaporizhia region and at least 19 more on Donetsk, killing at least 3 Ukrainians and wounding more than 10 in a single reporting cycle. And while bombs fall, Washington is having what can only be described as a very public internal breakdown over Ukraine policy, with U.S. Ambassador Julie Davis announcing she'll retire in June over a direct dispute with the Trump administration's direction. This isn't a footnote. This is a seismic crack in the Western Alliance's posture at the worst possible moment. Joining me now are Sophia Reeves, our economics and markets editor, and James Chen, our geopolitical analyst. Sophia, let me start with you. Is Ambassador Davis's departure a principled stand, or is it a sign that the adults are losing patience with a foreign policy establishment that got Ukraine catastrophically wrong from the beginning?
Thanks, Emma. Look, I'll say it plainly. This departure matters enormously, and not for the reasons the legacy media will tell you. The framing you'll hear from CNN and the BBC is that a heroic diplomat is walking away in protest against Trump's heartless abandonment of democratic Ukraine. And that framing is completely dishonest. What we actually have is a senior State Department official who was embedded in a policy framework, the Blinken-Nuland open-ended commitment framework, that has produced 3 years of industrial-scale slaughter with no defined end state, no victory conditions, and no territorial recovery worth speaking of. Russia controls more Ukrainian land today than it did in late 2022. Douglas Murray has been right about this for years. Good intentions dressed up as strategy are not strategy. And what concerns me deeply is that Davis's exit may trigger a broader exodus of institutional Ukraine hands from state at precisely the moment when coherent diplomatic engagement matters most. That institutional knowledge walking out the door could be more dangerous than any single policy dispute.
But Sophia, devil's advocate here, isn't there a legitimate argument that the Trump administration is creating the very vacuum you're worried about? that by signaling ambivalence toward Ukraine, Washington is actually handing Putin exactly what he wants. And James, what's your take on this?
Well, look, here's what I think Sophia is missing in an otherwise solid analysis. The institutional framework that Davis represented isn't something to mourn uncritically. We are talking about the same State Department apparatus that, for 3 years, treated Ukraine as an ideological project rather than a strategic calculation. The numbers here are brutal, and they matter. Over $175 billion in combined Western support, and Russia still holds the territory it seized. The front lines are static. Ukrainian manpower is depleted. You cannot separate Davis's departure from the policy legacy she was defending, and that policy legacy has an abysmal track record by any measurable outcome. Trump's instinct toward a negotiated settlement may be uncomfortable for the foreign policy establishment, but the establishment doesn't have a winning strategy to offer as an alternative. Show me the plan. Show me the benchmark. There isn't one.
I hear what James is saying, but with respect, that misses the point entirely. Yes, the previous strategy failed, I've said that. But the answer to a failed strategy is a better strategy, not a policy vacuum. And right now we don't have a Trump-Ukraine doctrine. We have uncertainty. Russia is launching 33 attacks on Zaporizhia in a single period. 833. That is not a regime preparing to negotiate in good faith. That is a regime testing whether Western resolve has cracked. And if the signal coming out of Washington is that America's diplomatic architecture is in internal chaos, Putin doesn't read that as an invitation to the peace table. He reads it as an invitation to press harder. That's the danger, not Trump's instincts, the absence of any coherent signal replacing the old framework.
Here's what I want to know, and I want both of you to be honest about this. Where does this actually go in the next 6 months? Because we've got a war grinding on, a diplomatic rupture in Washington, and European publics that polling data tells us are quietly losing the stomach for this. James, where do you see this playing out?
The way I see this playing out, and I want to be careful here because nothing about this is predetermined, the next 90 days of American positioning are going to be decisive. If the Trump administration can convert its transactional instincts into actual leverage architecture, coherent sanctions pressure, energy policy coordination with Europe, selective military commitments tied to benchmarks, there's a narrow path to forcing a negotiated framework that preserves Ukrainian sovereignty over pre-2022 lines. It's narrow, but it exists. What I'm watching is whether the administration fills the diplomatic vacuum Davis is leaving with something purposeful, or whether the departure just accelerates drift.
Here's what concerns me most, and this is the scenario I think markets and security analysts are genuinely underweighting. The risk isn't a dramatic American abandonment of Ukraine. It's something quieter and more corrosive. It's that the internal State Department dispute, the departures, the policy uncertainty, produces 6 months of ambiguous signals that Russia interprets as an open window. What history tells us, and 1938 is uncomfortable, but it's there, is that dictators don't respond to ambiguity with caution. They respond with acceleration. 833 attacks on Zaporizhia isn't Russia preparing a peace offer. If this trajectory continues without a clear Western countersignal, the risk is Ukraine faces the negotiating table from a position of military exhaustion rather than any kind of strength.
Sophia Reeves, James Chen, a genuinely important conversation and one that isn't finished by a long stretch. One thing's certain tonight. Somewhere in the Kremlin, they're watching Ambassador Davis pack her boxes with considerable satisfaction. That wraps up today's top stories. I'm Emma Hurt. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.